Every Tuesday for over 700 years, there's been a market in the streets of Newtown. Traders have set up their stalls selling all manner of goods, some selling the produce of the surrounding countryside, others bringing goods from further afield. It's to this market that the town owes its origins. Newtown is set in the Severn Valley, a few miles west of the present border between England and Wales. In medieval times, these borderlands were the scene of constant conflict between the Norman conquerors and the indigenous Welsh. The Commote or Manor of Cadwyn, in which Newtown lies, became caught up in this medieval turmoil between the Marcher lords and the Welsh princes. In 1267, a settlement between the warring factions was agreed in the Treaty of Montgomery between, for King Henry III, Simon de Montfort, and for the Welsh princes Llywelyn ap Griffith. Lands to the south and east of the Severn remained under English control from Montgomery Castle, while the lands to the north and west passed to Llywelyn, who agreed to pay 2,500 marks a year to the king. Llywelyn set up his administrative centre at Dolforwyn Castle near Abermule, across the valley from Montgomery. Work on the castle began in 1273. It was not only the military centre for the area, but outside the castle walls regular markets were held, with local farmers and travelling traders, burgesses of the Wynd, selling their wares. As Montgomery was only a few miles away, the burgesses there didn't take kindly to the new arrangement. But Llywelyn told them they had no right to interfere, as he was entitled to build castles in his own principality. The arrangement did not last. Llywelyn failed to pay homage to the king, by then Edward I, and worse, failed to pay his instalments due under the Treaty of Montgomery. In 1276, Edward declared war. Llywelyn was forced to retreat to his lands in North Wales. Dolforwyn Castle was taken and its destruction ordered. With it went the market, doubtless much to the satisfaction of the burgesses of Montgomery. The manor of Cadwyn was passed to the Marcher Lord Roger Mortimer, who had his administrative centre at Wigmore Castle. The need for a market town remained, of course, but not so close to Montgomery, if you don't mind. So it was that on the 16th of January 1279, Edward I granted a charter to Roger Mortimer to establish a market at the hamlet of Llanfair 3 miles upstream of Dolforwyn. The charter decreed that the market should be held every Tuesday, and so it is to this day. Before the establishment of the market, Llanfair was a small hamlet lying in a bend in the River Severn, protecting it to the north and east. It had a small church, a daughter church to the parish church of Llanfair, a mile and a half downstream on the other side of the river. With the granting of the charter, a new street plan was laid out, establishing the main streets of the town centre as they remain to this day. To complete the protection of the market town, a moated motte or mound was constructed with a castle on top. From here it's thought that 2 defensive banks ran at right angles to the river to complete the defences of the town. The remains of one bank crossed the park, the other ran to the river over what is still called the bank. To serve the increase in population, the small church was replaced on the same site by a much larger structure, some of which remains. The church was still dedicated to St Mary, giving its name to the town of Llanfair. But it was a new town, quite unlike anything that had stood there before, and as such it wasn't long before it was just being referred to as Newtown, or in Welsh, Adref Newydd. In Norman English legal documents it was Nova Villa, all 3 names being established by the 14th century. With the growth of the new town, the old parish was split, the north side of the river remaining as Llanfair, and the south side Newtown, with St Mary's as its parish church.
From the 14th century, the Prices, who were lords of the manor of Cadwyn, lived at Newtown Hall, which is the site where now stands the present Powys County Council offices. And they were there for about 700 years. The last 3 baronets were responsible for squandering a very, very rich estate. The 5th baronet was very much an eccentric, very humorous story, but not for his 3rd wife. The first 2 having died, and he'd had the bodies embalmed and put one each side of his bed in the bedroom. But the The bride-to-be insisted that the bodies were removed before any marriage was made and taken to the parish churchyard. The next baronet, the sixth, ended his life in the King's Bench prison, and with him for the last couple of years was his wife, and sadly when he died, in his will was the sum of just 1 shilling. The seventh baronet was in the Guards, and his body was found in a field in Pangbourne near Reading, 1791, and that was the end of a very, very rich estate, and what was left was put in chancery.
By the end of the 18th century, the town had changed little since its foundation 500 years before. The streets were lined with the still familiar timber-framed shops and houses. Some of these remain, although their originally thatched roofs have been replaced by slate. In fact, there are rather more timber-frame buildings in modern Newtown than at first meets the eye. Many shops with 19th and 20th century frontages look a good deal older from the back. Whilst much remains to remind us of earlier times, the end of the 18th century saw changes that would transform the face of Newtown, and also, in part at least, restore some of the former glories of the Newtown Hall estate. Since the founding of Newtown, one of the main commodities traded in the old market hall, which stood in the middle of Broad Street, had been wool, and the various types of cloth made from wool, mainly flannel. But up till the end of the 19th century, it was entirely a cottage industry. All the processes, including spinning and weaving, being done by rural labourers and their families in their homes. The finished cloth was collected by agents and sold in Shrewsbury. But technical innovations were leading to the mechanisation of some of the processes. The fulling or finishing of the cloth had been hitherto done in walk mills, where the cloth was trampled by foot to close up the fibres. Mills driven by water wheels were now taking over the process. Soon, carding and spinning machines followed. One of the first carding mills built was at Milford, where William Tyldesley built a weir across the river to feed the mill race. Within the town itself, the Overseven or Beander Mill was bought by the Reverend George Evors, a descendant of the Prices of Newtown Hall. It had been a corn mill since Tudor times. Evors converted it to wool processing. For Evors, it was the beginning of an attempt to recreate the glories of the Newtown Hall estate of old. Further downstream, 2 more weirs were constructed, one for Tibbott's Mill and the other to feed the Craigvryn Mill. The only process that was not mechanised by the early 19th century was the weaving. This was still done on hand looms, the looms generally being housed in weaving lofts above the houses. With the rapid growth of this new form of the woolen industry, the population increased in a spectacular manner. For the first time, the town expanded significantly beyond its medieval boundary. A substantial piece of ground to the south of the old town was enclosed under the 1795 Enclosures Act and became available for development. Closely packed houses with weaving lofts were built in the Ladywell area from about 1800 onwards. The houses, although back-to-back and small, generally housed more than 5 people each. There were more weavers than can be accommodated in the lofts above the houses, so in various parts of the town handloom factories were built, many by the Reverend Evors, 4 or more stories high. One of the difficulties the mid-Wales woolen industry faced was its remoteness from its markets in large conurbations. This problem was somewhat eased when, in 1819, the western branch of the Montgomeryshire Canal was opened to Newtown, or more correctly to Llanllwch, as it was entirely on the north side of the river. The extension of the canal was funded by local landowners and businessmen, including Sir Watkin Williams Wynne of Winstay and William Pugh of Brynllawr, Kerry. At first, traffic on the canal was limited by shortage of water. A plan to channel water from above the Beander Weir had been thwarted by the mill owners downstream, who didn't want the supply of water to their mill diminished in this fashion. So the canal company had to build themselves a pumping station with its own weir and water wheel further downstream. This was completed in 1821, and then the canal came into full use. Whilst the canal boats were able to berth within a short distance of the manufactories, there was still the problem of getting the goods across the river. There was only one bridge, a narrow wooden one, which crossed from the end of Broad Street to the Tregunnon Road. This was quite inadequate for the expected increase in traffic. Even before the canal was completed, its promoters were seeking subscriptions for a new bridge across the river. In 1826, the Long Bridge was completed. It's a three-arch stone bridge designed by the county surveyor Thomas Penson. The cast-iron footways on either side were added, again by Penson, in 1857. As well as improving access to the canal, the new bridge opened up other possibilities. Now land at the north end of the bridge could be laid out for development. Within a few years, Penagloddfa became almost a second Newtown. The pattern was much the same as in Ladywell, with a mixture of back-to-back houses, weaving lofts and handloom factories. Some of these units were quite self-contained, with houses, factories and shops all in the same block. For the people living and working in them, they were perhaps a little too self-contained. Workers were paid not in coins of the realm, but tokens issued by their employer, which could only be used in the employer's shops, tommy or truck shops at the employer's prices. By now, Newtown was the biggest woolen manufacturing town in mid-Wales, but all its output of pieces or bolts of cloth had to be sent to Shrewsbury or Welshpool to be sold in wholesale markets there. The local manufacturers decided that Newtown was now big enough to have a flannel exchange of its own. Under the leadership of William Pugh, an imposing building, again by Thomas Penson, was erected by the Long Bridge and opened in 1832. Reports of the weekly flannel sales indicate some of the difficulties faced by the manufacturers. Full production could only be achieved when there was plenty of water in the river. On the other hand, the finished cloth could only be dried in the open air on racks. This made it difficult for manufacturers to respond quickly to variations in the market, and they often found themselves with large quantities of cloth that they could only sell for less than the cost of manufacture. In the early 1830s, a depression in trade caused a number of bankruptcies. William Tyldesley went under, and then, most catastrophic of all, William Pugh in 1835. He fled to Caen in France to escape his creditors. As a consequence, the working people of the town suffered great privation, and it's not surprising that they turned to political action to attempt to improve their lot. In 1837, the first Chartist meeting in Wales was held in Newtown. There was an attempt to form a people's militia. Leading citizens and mill owners became alarmed, so in 1839 the army was sent for. A number of disused factories were taken over as barracks. The military were to remain in the town for about 7 years. Throughout these years, St. Mary's Church had served the parish of Newtown, but standing as it did so close to the river, it was frequently inundated by the floodwater that swept down from the Cambrian mountains. By the mid-1840s, trade in the town had revived to the extent that it was possible to start work on a new parish church, St. David's, built on higher ground to the south of the Ladywell area. Once again, the architect was Thomas Penson. At about this time, the tall chimneys characteristic of Victorian industry appeared. Steam power had arrived, also power looms. Output increased, but the lot of the workers had not. Many were thrown out of work by the new technology. It was to this town, by then dubbed the Busy Leeds of Wales, that its most famous son returned in 1856. Robert Owen was born in his father's saddler's shop in Broad Street in 1771. He went to a small school at Newtown Hall, and at the age of 10 left the town to work as a draper's assistant to a Mr. McGuffog in Stamford, Lincolnshire, moving later to London and then to Manchester. At the age of 20, he became a factory manager with 500 employees. He was already developing his revolutionary ideas of business management and social organization. He believed that if he looked after the needs of his employees, both they and the business would benefit. He provided education and better living conditions. In 1799, Owen bought the New Lanark cotton mill. Here he put his ideas on social reform into practice. He refused to employ children under 10 years old and limited the working day to 12 hours. He believed that people were formed by their environment. As well as schools for the children, he introduced adult education for his workers with the aim of forming the habits of order, regularity, temperance and industry. Physical development was encouraged by holding dancing classes 3 nights a week. He campaigned for factory reform, but his ideas were too advanced for Parliament, and he became disillusioned. So, in 1824, he took his ideas of community and cooperation to the United States, where he set up a model community embodying all his ideas at New Harmony, Indiana. It was not a success, and he returned to Britain in 1828. On his return, he found that his ideas were gaining ground. In 1821, he'd coined the term cooperative society, and now Owenite cooperative societies were being formed everywhere. His ideas were also being taken up by the many trade unions that were being formed in the wake of the economic upheavals that followed the Napoleonic Wars. For the rest of his life, he continued to write and lecture on his ideas for industrial and social reform. The town Robert Owen had left was still a small market town of less than 1,000 inhabitants. When Owen returned in 1858, he would hardly have recognized Newtown. The population had grown almost tenfold. Factories with tall, smoking chimneys were everywhere. The clatter of the looms and the workers' clogs replaced the silence that would have enveloped the town on all but market days. But it was not just Newtown that was changing. Society itself was changing throughout the world, and many of those changes were as a consequence of Robert Owen's thought and teaching. He must have been appalled at the conditions of work in Newtown's mills. Robert Owen died in the Bear Hotel, only a few yards from his birthplace, on the 17th of November 1858. His burial next to his parents alongside the walls of the old church was not without controversy. Owen had strong views on organized religion, but in the years following his death, there was a growing demand that he be properly remembered in Newtown. So, in 1902, following a national appeal by the Cooperative Union, money was raised to place commemorative railings around Owen's tomb. The appeal was greatly oversubscribed, so the surplus was added to the money needed to build a free library for Newtown. It's this building that now, appropriately, houses the Robert Owen Museum. The statue of Owen was unveiled in 1956, and in 1994 a copy was made and placed outside the headquarters of the Cooperative Bank in Manchester. Only a few years after the death of Robert Owen, events occurred that were to change the face of Newtown yet again. The Oswestry to Newtown Railway opened, linking the town to the national rail network. A young local businessman was quick to see the opportunities this afforded. Price Jones, born in Llanllwchaian in 1834. At the age of 12, he was apprenticed to a local draper in the Cross. Having learned his trade, he set up in business on his own account. Realizing that trade in such a sparsely populated area would be limited, he hit upon the idea of exploiting the railway to reach markets across the country and beyond. And so, the first mail-order business in the world was established. His stock in trade were the woolen cloths and flannels made in local factories. By this time, power looms had been introduced. Mills such as the Cambrian were able to mass-produce flannel in large quantities. Handloom weaving continued as cloth produced this way was softer and finer than can be produced on power looms. Hand-woven flannels for underwear became luxury items, and soon Price Jones was selling them to the most exalted customers, including Queen Victoria herself. By 1879, his business had grown to the extent that he was able to erect a massive new warehouse opposite the railway station. Price Jones's Royal Welsh Warehouse. Price Jones knew the value of publicity and adorned his new building with copies of the medals his flannels had won at exhibitions around the world. The business continued to grow, so the warehouse was extended in 1887. 8 years later, the Royal Welsh Factory was built on the other side of the road. This large building occupied a rather limited site, which meant it had to abut the row of houses on Kerry Road. A curiosity of this arrangement was that the end house acquired the tallest domestic chimney in Britain. A final addition to the warehouse was added in 1901, and by then such was the volume of trade that Price Jones's own post office was included. But by the end of the 19th century, a colder wind of change was blowing through the town. Newtown manufacturers were finding that the economies of scale of the large Lancashire and Yorkshire mills were impossible to compete with, and it was rumoured that Price Jones was buying cloth from Rochdale and selling it on as Welsh flannel. The once prized hand-loom flannel was being replaced by flannelette and machine-knitted cotton. Although Price Jones's survived into the 20th century as the town's largest employer, many people were forced to leave the town to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Some left the woolen industry behind forever. Others were able to transport their skills to the new world. In North Adams, Massachusetts, Sanford Blackington's woolen mill was operated almost entirely by expatriate Newtonians. Blackington Village Cemetery became the last resting place for many whose lives had begun in the busy streets of Newtown. By the later years of the 19th century, Sir Price Jones's influence extended beyond the workplace. He'd become a very rich man and had also been knighted in the 1887 Jubilee Honours List. In 1890, he used his great wealth to build All Saints' Church in Penygloddfa. It was a daughter church of Llanllwchaion Parish Church. Sir Price had always had an interest in supporting the social life of his employees. In the early years of the 20th century, Sir Price promoted the Royal Welsh Warehouse Sports and Music Festival, which took place annually on the Royal Welsh Warehouse Recreation Ground on Poole Road. These events became enormous, attracting up to 15,000 people, many of them old Newtonians who'd been forced to leave the town by the decline of the woolen industry. There were brass band and choir competitions, as well as all manner of track and field events. In 1913, there was the added attraction of the first aeroplane to be seen flying in Newtown. It was piloted by the famous air ace Gustav Hamil. Despite all this, it was becoming clear that Newtown's days as the woolen capital of Wales were coming to an end. In 1910, the Cambrian mill suffered a serious fire, but as it mainly affected the storerooms, the mill was able to continue production. 2 years later, a more serious fire struck the mill. One night, the entire factory was destroyed in a fire that started and spread so quickly that rumours of arson spread through the town almost as fast as the flames. Nothing was ever proved, but the mill had been well insured, and the fact that the directors quickly wound the company up did little to dispel suspicions. The destruction of the Cambrian marked the end of Newtown as a major force in the woolen industry, although the commercial mill staggered on for another 20 years, although they too had a serious fire in 1911. Woolen manufacture didn't finally end in the area until the small mill at Mochtre, run by the Leach family, closed on the death of Seymour Leach in 1963. As everywhere else, the Great War changed everything. The men of the 7th Royal Welsh Fusiliers, the local volunteer battalion, formed up in Broad Street and were marched off to war, many never to return. Physically, the town was little changed by the war, but the hurt, the grief, can only be guessed at now when one looks at the 175 names carved on the cenotaph erected in memory of those who fell. For some years after the unveiling of the cenotaph in 1926, it became the tradition for the annual carnival procession to stop for that year's carnival queen to lay a posy of flowers at the foot of the cenotaph, in memory of those husbands and boyfriends who did not return. The town that the survivors of the trenches returned to was as depressed as anywhere in those grim years. The woolen industry had all but gone, and not much had replaced it. In an effort to teach returning soldiers peacetime skills, the remains of the Cambrian mills were used as a government instructional factory. Useful building schemes were undertaken, including council houses at Park Terrace, Dinham Terrace, Coed y Frith and Maes Derwen. A new bandroom was built for Newtown Silver Band, and at last the livestock markets were moved from the main streets of the town to a purpose-built Smithfield on Poole Road. Despite these efforts, the population of the town continued to fall, and by the late 1930s, it was lower than it had been since the early 1820s. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 brought a temporary end to the decline. Newtown became a garrison town. Price Jones's old Seven Valley Mills, virtually unused since the 1890s, made an excellent barracks. The County Pavilion, a World War I aircraft hangar brought to the town in 1921 as a concert hall, was also requisitioned for the military, with at times up to 4,000 soldiers in the town.
I was 18 when the war started. I remember the Sunday morning when the announcement came on the wireless, as we called it then. And my father put the wireless on, we were expecting something, and it was announced that the Britain was at war with Germany. And I remember feeling quite excited. I rushed out into the middle of Market Street, and Marion Payne came out from the baker's opposite, and she was all excited. And she said, my father said that we'll soon be eating black bread. I said, black bread? How horrible. Well, my mother says that we'll soon be having rations and so on. We won't be able to eat very much. I went back in and my mother was crying. I couldn't understand it. But of course she'd lived through the First World War, and she was very upset. My father was comforting her. So I went to the piano to play, and of course I played what happened to be Top of the Pops at the time, When the Poppies Bloom Again. That sent my mother off into more wails of horror. So that was the beginning of the war there. Newtown was designated a garrison town, and after our own people were called up, the local boys were called up and went first to Wrexham, I think, and then on to Northern Ireland. The first people we had were the Irish Regiment, the Enniskillen Fusiliers. And they arrived one particular day, went into the coffee house next door to our place, and as they came out again, I was pumping up my bicycle to go and ride down to Welshpool to see my cousin who'd just got back from Dunkirk. And the cheekiest of them said, "Can I help you?" and came marching up the lane. And that was my future husband. And when we heard about the boys that had been killed on Kerry Road alone, there were about 5 boys killed, and all of them happened to be only sons, which was so sad. And that's when the war really hit us. After we were married, I had a telegram boy came to the door, and my mother happened to see him through the window, and she went to the door so that I didn't take it first. And she came back and said, it's all right, he's all right, he's wounded, but he's coming back to this country. And that was my husband, had been wounded in Camswood after the landings, D-Day landings.
With the end of the war, the Shadow factory was converted to peacetime use. It was given by the government to Tube Investments Limited, who installed one of their subsidiaries, Phillips Cycles Limited. This provided much-needed work for local ex-servicemen returning from the war. By the beginning of 1946, the factory was in full swing, and bikes were being delivered to customers all across the world. The local bike shop, Caulfields of Short Bridge Street, also took delivery of their first batch of Newtown-built machines. At the end of the war, there was again a desperate housing shortage. Apart from the 4 small pre-war council house schemes, the only houses available for young married couples to raise their families in were the substandard houses left from the Woolen boom in the 19th century, and there weren't enough of those to go round. In desperation, some families occupied nissen huts abandoned by the army on Dolvor Road. Conditions there were even worse. The town council had foreseen this problem and had drawn up plans for a large council estate, also on Dolvor Road. However, work on the site was painfully slow due to materials and labour shortage. In the early stages, the manpower problem was solved by using German prisoners of war. They were paid, but money was deducted from their pay to cover their board and lodging in the prisoner of war camp at Glandulas. In honour of Robert Owen, the estate was named Garth Owen. It was laid out along the lines of a pre-war garden city. The first 2 houses were completed by the end of 1947, but because of shortages of material, it was to be another 2 years before all 84 houses of Phase 1 were completed. Additional houses were started immediately, and building work continued well into the 1950s. This left the problem of what to do about the decayed weavers' cottages that made up much of the central area of the town. Myserandir Farm to the west of Garth Owen was bought by the town council and plans drawn up for a slum clearance development. But before any houses could be built, the town was hit by a disaster that was to threaten its very existence. The Severn, which had for centuries provided protection to the town, had always occasionally flooded the lower areas of the town. But what happened on the night of the 3rd and 4th of December 1960 was without precedent. After days of persistent rain, the river rose and rose. It rose until its banks could no longer contain it. A substantial portion of the floodwater cut off the bend in the river and raced through the town at high speed. The damage was made worse by debris picked up by the torrent. This included telegraph poles that had been stored in the car park. They were propelled through the town centre properties like battering rams. The flood was at its height during the night, but as dawn broke and the waters began to recede, people came out to see the effects of the frightening force of the floodwaters. Hundreds of people had been made homeless, and most of the shops in the town centre had been damaged, some of them destroyed. With so many houses damaged, it was clear that the slum clearance and rehousing scheme would have to be accelerated. But progress on the work did not go as quickly as had been hoped, and anyway, expert opinion was that the flood had been a freak of nature, the sort of thing that might be expected to happen only once in 150 years. Expert opinion was wrong. Almost exactly 4 years later, on the night of the 13th and 14th of December 1964, it happened again. After 2 days of continuous torrential rain, the river again began to rise. By the middle of the evening, floodwater began to flow across Broad Street. By midnight, the street was impassable. By the early hours of the morning, the torrent was as devastating as it had been 4 years earlier. One by one, the shop windows burst with a noise like rifle fire. The contents of each shop, grocery, ironmongery, jewellery and everything else was immediately carried away, some of it to be found days later many miles downstream. As the flood grew in intensity, pieces of tarmac the size of snooker tables were lifted from the streets and carried away, and pavements torn up. The heart of the town was being ripped out, and for it to happen twice in 4 years indicated it was now no freak event. As dawn broke on Sunday the 14th of December, people again came out to see what had happened during the night. They were horrified. Newtown could not survive any more of this. Indeed, one school of opinion was that the town should be abandoned and another town built on higher ground. Alternatively, it might be possible to build some form of flood defenses, but the cost of these was way beyond the resources of a small town. Government help was sought, and fortunately it was given. A flood bank was built and temporary sheet piling was put in. Whilst these measures would not stop the river flooding the town, at least they would reduce the high-speed flow of water that had contributed so much to the devastation. Research was started to see if a more permanent defence for the town was feasible. Work on the slum clearance scheme was accelerated. Almost all of the Ladywell area was demolished and the people moved to Mysorandir. Houses in other low-lying parts of the town were also cleared. Whilst these measures safeguarded the immediate future of the town, longer-term dangers to the economy of Mid Wales were emerging. In 1964, a report commissioned by the Welsh Office was published. Under the chairmanship of Professor Arthur Beecham, a committee had investigated the causes of depopulation in Mid Wales. The report made grim reading. The committee had found a small and declining, aging and scattered population, making public services costly and transport uneconomic. There was a continual outward flow of younger and more able people. Agriculture was a declining source of employment and also heavily dependent on government subsidies. To put it bluntly, Mid Wales, and Newtown with it, was dying. Now, the idea of building a new town in Montgomeryshire had been around for some time, but had generally met with opposition from those who feared that a large conurbation would upset the balance of the essentially rural communities surrounding it. In the event, the government abandoned the idea of a completely new town and announced that Newtown, under the New Towns Act of 1965, would become a new town. The medieval Newtown was to be reborn as a 20th century new town. The Mid Wales Newtown Development Corporation began work in May 1968. By the following year, work was underway on new factories on the Poole Road. Meanwhile, work had also begun at the other end of the town on what had been County Council small holdings. Houses were being built to house the new workers coming to the town. Of course, if the new developments were to be successful, adequate defence against flooding was now essential. In 1971, work began on an ambitious flood prevention scheme. The lower section of the river was diverted to allow swifter flow of floodwaters downstream, whilst either side of the long bridge, the bed of the river was dredged and lowered. The Halfpenny Bridge, which had withstood such a battering in 1960 and 64, was demolished and replaced by a single-span footbridge much higher above the water. A massive wall and flood banks were built around the historic loop in the river. With the centre protected, work continued on expanding the town. More houses and more factories were built with the intention of doubling the population of the town from around 5,000 to about 11,000. The town centre was changing too. The last of the Ladywell area was demolished to make way for a new office block, and a number of old buildings were removed to make way for a loop road designed to keep traffic out of the main shopping streets. Of course, bringing so many new people into a small, if dwindling, community was not without its problems.
What the Development Board did was build a lot of factories, build a lot of houses on estates on the periphery of the town. Those houses had to be filled, and so the people were brought in and they had to have a job. So, in fact, there weren't so many jobs for the local people as we were hoping. And in fact, I took that up with the chief executive of the time, and I said, this isn't really doing us very much good. It's the people coming in who have to have priority for the jobs because you must fill your houses. And he agreed. That was the truth. We had thought it was for the development of Newtown, but in fact, having a mole in the Welsh office, we found out that it was simply overspill for Birmingham, and that it was the second choice. The first choice had been a town in Staffordshire, and Newtown was a second choice, partly because a certain Labour MP down the valleys thought that Newtown had become a hotbed for nationalists, and that's the truth. And he decided that a good old influx of English people would be a very healthy thing for them. Eventually, the development stabilized, and the people accepted, as they've always accepted, the incomers. The incomers became natives, more or less, and I think they all loved living in Newtown. So many have told me they love Newtown. It's beautiful surroundings and clean air, more or less. That I think the charm of Newtown, which brings our own people back, now often brings newcomers back if they ever move away. And certainly they've all settled down, and I think Newtown more or less is stabilized, and hopefully will go on to greater strengths. I hope so.
By 1989, the Development Board for Rural Wales, as the Development Corporation had by then become, announced that the town had reached the maximum size possible under the plan set out over 20 years earlier. From now on, the task was to sustain the town at its present size. There were still one or two projects to be accomplished, one of which was a second road bridge across the river. A bridge from Poole Road to Dolavon Road had been part of the original 1968 plan, but work did not begin until 1992. "14 months later, it was opened to traffic and named the Cambrian Bridge, an apposite name as it linked the site of the old Cambrian foundry on the south side with that of the Cambrian mills on the north. As the 20th century drew to a close, Newtown was looking forward to a period of stability of a kind that it had not enjoyed for over 200 years. The new housing estates that had appeared somewhat brutal when they were built had matured into comfortable residential areas. It's not surprising that not all the speculative ventures that were embarked upon in the new factories thrived. Some succeeded, some didn't. Two companies grew to be major international companies. The name Laura Ashley is known worldwide, with shops in every major city. Laura and Bernard Ashley began manufacturing in Carno, a few miles west of Newtown, in 1963. As the firm grew, they opened new premises elsewhere, culminating in 1987 with the massive Texplan factory on the Mochdre estate. In 1973, three young men, Kevin Curran, Trevor Wheatley and Ken Briggs, started an electronics business, making control equipment for electric motors. Using their initials, they called their business KTK. It grew rapidly, and under the name Control Techniques, it's now a global business. Their world headquarters are in a modern building on the Poole Road, and they have a major production facility next door to Laura Ashley's on the Mochdre estate. Despite all these changes, Newtown remains what it always was, a relatively small town set among the sparsely populated hills and valleys of mid-Wales. Occasionally, the Severn still throws its worst at the town, but now the waters are harmlessly channeled on their way. The town centre remains recognisable as the same place it was 100 years ago. Tuesday is still market day, as decreed by Edward I over 700 years ago, and Newtown remains the economic and social centre of a widespread rural community.